Welcome to our panel discussion on video nasties and censorship. I am Victoria, your Disney queen at BanterFlix. I am joined by my beautiful friend Maria down below. And with us today is Dr. Sian Barber from Queen's University and Dr. Johhny Walker from Northumbria. Thank you both so much for joining us.
Good to be here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, you both have a very impressive resume. Like, Sian, I remember you telling me your entire PhD was on 1970s censorship, and you showed me the beautiful printed out folder of it, and I was like, gimme.
I was just trying to convince you not to do a PhD, I think, at that point.
Well, it sort of worked. Might come back to it.
Yeah.
And Johhny, you yourself, whenever Kate Egan from Northumbria was meant to join us, but unfortunately she was sick. Hopefully she's watching. Johhny came highly recommended from Kate, and I noticed on your kind of wee bio on the university website, you've got a lot of work behind you. There's a lot of horror books. You've contributed to a lot of edited versions. There's a Hammer Horror, and I'm near sure I have one from like 2015 that you worked on since then, because the name rang a bell as soon as I saw it.
Quite possibly, but thank you for being so kind. People rarely are.
I love horror, so anyone that writes about it, I'm like, I want to be your friend.
Well, we can be friends.
Thank you very much. So, Maria, do you want to take us off with the first question there?
Absolutely. So, okay, folks. So before we dive into our discussion on video nasties, we would love to know what is your personal relationship with, what your personal relationship with horror is like. Sian, why don't you go first?
Oh no. Well, I'm just a big joke in the horror scene, actually, because I don't really like horror very much. Everyone always mocks me when we end up at conferences, and I'm sitting there going, oh God, is it over yet? I'm less interested in the kind of the horror on the screen idea and more in how, I suppose, audiences, viewers engage with horror and what the taboos are and how those taboos are sort of addressed or controlled in different periods. So I guess that's my relationship with horror. But yeah, I'm the biggest baby ever when it comes to actually watching stuff. Johhny, on the other hand.
Well, yeah, I mean, I love horror films, and I always have, and it's, you know, it's a cliche, but it's one of those things whereby I was a kid, wasn't allowed to watch horror films, so I ended up watching horror films, you know, beyond the purview of the powers that be. And to be honest, it was fan magazines and articles about the video nasties that really got me into the genre, to be honest. Because, you know, when I was 12 or 13, I thought I knew a lot about horror from, you know, all of the films that I'd seen up until to that point. But I remember seeing an article about the video nasties, and there was all these titles of all these films that I just had never heard of before. So, you know, it was the video nasties was the gateway drug, if you like, into what happened subsequently. So
you came to it quite young then.
Yeah, I mean, so I'm not old enough to have lived through the video nasties. Like I came to it in the late 90s, early 2000s, when, you know, these films were established as cult classics or whatever. But still, you know, even then, you know, to the aspiring horror fan, little was known about them really, beyond, you know, the hardcore group of fans who were actively hunting them out, because you couldn't see a lot of them even then. So,
well, just going off that, because even I've been a horror fan since I was about 5 years old, and I only came across video nasties a couple of years ago. So for anyone that isn't like a diehard fan of video nasties, could you give us kind of an overview of what they are, and if there's any famous examples that you could give us? Either one is up to you.
I'll tell you what, I'll start, and then Johhny can sort of chip in, and we'll get a bit of a conversation going. I think what's really interesting about the video nasties, and certainly how I became aware of them, was the fact that this was a lot of films that all sort of hit the public imagination at about the same time. Some of them had been out for a while, some of them had just been newly released, but it was the technology that was new. The fact that this material was available on home video made it available in the home. So that was what a lot of the discussion around them at the time was about. It was the fact that this was unregulated, the fact that people weren't collectively viewing those. It was the idea that somebody could go watch something by themselves. And as many times as they wanted, they could rewind the really gory bits or the nasty bits and watch them at their leisure. So it's the technology really that brought them together under this sort of very generic label. But I think there's quite a lot of famous cases in there as well, where there's still films which really touch on a lot of taboo issues, and that are kind of touchstones in terms of histories of controversies, things like I Spit on Your Grave, Cannibal Holocaust, the really extreme examples. I'm sure Johhny knows a few more off the top of your head.
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, it's strange because what you're saying there, Sian, about it being a significant technological moment, and that ultimately being the unknown thing that worried the censorious. It's amazing how arbitrary that list of banned titles is, really, because it's difficult to watch any, say, 3 films from the final banned list and identify explicit continuity, but across the piece. I mean, of course there are similarities, but a film like The Driller Killer, for instance, is a far cry away from a film like I Spit on Your Grave. They're doing
totally
different things. Yeah, for sure. But also what's super interesting, I think, at least, about the Video Nasties panic is that it just so happens that the horror genre became the focus of mass media panic, because 12 months prior to this, the likes of Mary Whitehouse and others were concerned with pornography, right? And people were concerned about video giving people access to porn and stuff, but it was the horror film that captured the public's imagination, that really picked up steam in the mainstream media. But it needn't have been that. It just so happened that it was that, right? So a lot of, I think, coincidence and fate, if you will, plays a role in all of this, right? None of this we can never tell what's going to be the next thing. It just captures the imagination, right?
There was just something in that time period, everything just came together at once, and it just happened to be horror films that got the brunt of it.
Well, I mean, when the term was coined, which I think was like March 1982, like around about April 1982, Peter Chippendale's article in the Sunday Times, I think, video was super, super popular by this point, right? It was, the market was reaching saturation point. So everybody was talking about video. So I guess, if a mainstream journalist was to write anything disreputable about video, that was the time that it was going to catch on. And Peter Chippendale wrote an article about horror films. So here we are.
So here we are.
I suppose it's that kind of thing of like, in every kind of technology, there comes a turning point where people kind of look at it and go, hold on, there's like almost too much access here. It's and with videotapes, like that was just a whole new world of media.
Absolutely. And I think you can trace that. I suppose moral panic is the kind of the go-to phrase, but I think that anxiety about what this new form is going to offer, what are the dangers, like you say, Maria, it's access, but it's also how people are going to engage with it. Literally, you look at the files for a lot of stuff in the late 70s from the BBFC, and the things that they're worried about are precisely the new technology allowing people to engage with this material in very specific ways. For example, the video files for The Exorcist, it's about saying somebody could actually look at the particular sequences and rewind them and watch them again and again and again. And that's bound to bother somebody. That's bound to disturb someone. And you're reading it and you're thinking, well, probably, but if they're doing that, then, So the debate about what this technology offers is really pertinent. And I think you can see that throughout every time a new technology becomes available, whether it's streaming, whether it's downloads, whether it's whatever technology is available.
Yeah, you notice that even nowadays with social media, like you were saying, Johhny, with Video Nasties, the panic around it kind of followed on from the fear of easy access to pornography. Like there's kids as young as 8 like can just Google on their phones nowadays, which is terrifying, but at the same time it's like it's an awkward one, because like we'll get to this later on during the panel, but it's the idea of who has the right to censor who. Like, should there be a higher body to do this kind of thing? And at what point are you, obviously not with pornography, like more with the horror genre, like are you impeding on people's freedoms by telling them, no, you cannot watch this because it will have this effect on you? I remember one of our lectures when I was doing my master's with you, Sian, you mentioned there was a very famous quote about someone like higher up in a class system could watch something and not be affected, but a random factory worker could watch it and go out and kill a load of people. That
sort of class basis, the idea that censors have this sort of almost benevolent authority to say, we know what's right for you, we are the experts, don't worry, we're sort of paternalistic, we're going to, be mindful of what you can handle and what, all that runs throughout sort of the history of the BBFC. But I mean, that runs right up to the current day. I mean, literally a couple of years ago, they made a decision about sexual violence, and any film with any hint of sexual violence or scene of sexual violence has to be a minimum 15 now. This was a change that I think was 2018. So, they're very, very hands-on still.
Yeah.
It's not like everything's become much more liberal. Quite the contrary. It's just perhaps horror is slightly shifted off their radar a little bit.
Yeah, that's interesting, actually. Because sorry, what were you going to say, Johhny?
No, sorry, I was just going to sort of piggyback on what Sian says, and just there is a huge class dynamic here, and it's not like the BBFC. I mean, maybe not so nowadays, although I wouldn't necessarily want to comment, but certainly when Furman was at the helm, certainly at the height of the video nasties panic, they weren't being secretive about that. I mean, Furman came out and said essentially what you've just said about, a factory worker getting a hold of a copy of whatever, and it, that factory worker somehow being more impressionable than somebody who was middle to upper class, which of course is bananas. It's ludicrous to make decisions based purely on class. I mean, one of the things that I will say is that, I mean, from a sort of an industry standpoint, I guess producers of entertainment benefit from classification, as it were, because they want to usually target a specific demographic, and classification enables them to do that. But of course, it's rarely just, or certainly was rarely just about classification back in the day. I mean, the BBFC changed their name from the British Board of Film Censors to the British Board of Film Classification, but that was like a PR gimmick, really. I mean, because they were super censorious, like super censorious. And it's just, I don't know, I think it's strange how they want to police their image and but be explicit about their classism while also being uber sensorial. Like, I mean, I don't know. It's the whole thing is very messy and raises a lot of questions about the BBFC's purpose, right?
Totally. Yeah, it's a lot of it's smoke and mirrors as well, isn't it? We do this, but really we're actually talking about doing this, and I think you're absolutely right about their image. I think they were very aware that they were suddenly under scrutiny, because that's the other thing, they quite like flying below the radar and not having to be in the public spotlight. But obviously the video nasties really threw them onto the front pages, and a lot of the newspaper articles that were covering the controversies were saying, well, who are these people who are making these decisions? And there was a very famous article that basically doorstepped all the examiners and took their pictures and said, these people make the decisions for you. So and it was sort of a big expose to say that these are the people making the decisions. What do we know about them? And that's not what they wanted at all. They quite like being in the shadows.
It's the personalization there that actually makes it a bit terrifying for them, because when you're the shadow chancellor, as it were, nobody can really say boo. But in that case, yeah, it kind of reminds me of, it's slightly a tangent, it kind of reminds me of when we studied, I think it was cinema and history, and there was a story about censorship in the Belfast area, where it was, I believe, Last Tango in Paris wasn't allowed to be shown, but you could go see it in Bangor, and the fact that it happened meant that loads of people went to Bangor to see it, because it was in the papers, because you shouldn't go see this, it's not morally right, and then it was, everybody now wanted to see it.
Yeah, but that's what happens though, isn't it? You tell people they can't do something and then they automatically want to do it anyway. Yeah, the Last Tango case is really, really fascinating. But obviously that belongs in a completely different bracket, and sort of circling back to Johhny's earlier point, this idea that it wasn't just a definitive list of very extreme films or even a definitive list of horror films. There was so much that was just kind of thrown in together and saying, oh, well, they're all just nasty. And I think like people like Kim Newman and certainly Julian Petley have sort of done a lot of work looking through that list and saying, well, why is this here? Why is this being included? And, a lot of that comes down to taste and that idea of class, I think, as well. Oh, that doesn't sound very nice. I think we should put that on the list.
Even the word nasty, it's very emotive. Like, it's a very specific choice of words. Kind of jumping off what we were talking about there about James Furman. Obviously, the BBFC would have flown under the radar, like you guys said. They weren't really in the public eye. Did that change when James Furman came on the scene?
Yeah, I mean, he took over as head of the board in 75, and they'd had a rocky couple of years up to that point, with a lot more coming. They'd obviously had to deal with things like Straw Dogs, Clockwork Orange, The Devils, Last Tango in Paris, The Exorcist. It was a really kind of heavy period for having to do that. And the guy who'd been there previously had made not necessarily a mess of it, but he didn't do PR. He was really bad at talking to the press. He really hated that kind of, I have to be nice to people and I have to work with people. He just thought that wasn't really the gig at all. So I think Furman was seen much more as somebody who could be outward facing and who could engage a bit more. But again, it goes back to what Johhny said. Like they were very aware of their public image, and I think they thought by kind of shoving somebody out there to go and sort of smooth things over, it left the rest of them alone to get on with the work in the dark. Effectively,
well, certainly, like anecdotally, when I was a 12, 13-year-old getting into the video nasties for the first time, I knew who James Furman was because people would write about how much they hated him all the time in the fan press. He really was, seen to be this wicked, evil figure who, stolen people's childhoods away because he was this prolific censor. And I mean, it's sort of funny looking back. Well, it is and it isn't, because people's lives were ruined as a consequence of the video nasties panic. Less so the distributors. Like one of the arguments that's often made is that independent distributors really took a hammering from the Passing of the Video Recordings Act, which it's not as simple as that. I mean, as I said earlier, by 1982, 1983, the market was super saturated anyway. So like all the smaller companies were sort of like fading away. But the people who were really smacked by the whole discourse surrounding video nasties was the independent video retail, the retailers, the shopkeepers, because they were being written about in the media a lot for being the filth merchants, as it were, who were peddling this stuff to kids. So, those are the people who are really hammered. So, there's a class dynamic in and of itself. So when you've got horror fans coming to the video nasties as sort of like champions of the underdog, as it were, James Furman is not going to get an easy ride in that situation.
Not at all. Even in the article you sent through to us, Sian, before the panel, like when you think of censorship, at least when I do, I tend to think of more conservative views. But even the title of the article was, he was loathed by the left and feared by the right. I was not expecting him to be like hated by both sides, quote unquote. That was surprising.
I know, and I was slightly taken aback by it. It's like, okay, I sound very pro Furman. Wonderful, thanks very much. Love being quoted. Love being quoted in the press. I think what I find fascinating about the whole censorship debate, though, is that it's basically a lose-lose. You're always going to be annoying somebody. The fact that you are making a decision, people are not going to agree with you. The left are going to think that you're interfering and saying, how dare you, free speech, whatever. And the right are going to say, why are you allowing this filthy, nasty material to exist in the first place? Why aren't you stricter? It is a lose-lose. And I think even when you look at more contemporary and recent cases, that debate doesn't really change much. It's completely circular. So.
Yeah, it never seems to go away. It just seems to come back every couple of years, like you and Johhny were saying, with something new. Just whatever happens to be in our attention span at the time. Maria and I had a question there about when Furman used to go into conferences and stuff. Have you got it there, Maria?
Yeah. So the article mentioned that Furman would go into industry conferences and presentations with like show reels of cut and uncut versions of films as proof of, as we've been kind of talking about already, why viewers needed to be protected from those like horrible images. How far would you guys both? How far would you both agree or disagree as film scholars that they need to be protected, quote unquote?
What? So what people do I think people need to be protected from images?
As a film scholar who has studied these images, do you think Furman was, or even the BBFC in general, were right to regulate these the way they did?
No, absolutely not. I don't think they were right to do it. Largely because, I mean, well, firstly, I'm personally anti-censorship, but also for some of the reasons that we've discussed thus far. The panic was, as they tend to be, wholly arbitrary and random, and the selection process was not thorough or rigorous. So if that's the base level, if that's the foundation upon which you're building your strategy to regulate, then nothing, it's indefensible really, because the thesis, as it were, is, has holes in it. So no, I think it was a bad idea then, and I think it's a bad idea now.
Yeah, I mean, broadly speaking, I'd have to agree with you. I think the process was arbitrary. It was really messy. It was very, very unclear. A lot of for the period that certainly I know very well, like 70s and 80s, they didn't really have a formal policy. They were literally making it up as they went along. And what's really clear from the files is that everyone has things that they like and things that they don't like. So you really get this kind of ebb and flow of what people are interested in, what people absolutely loathe. And to me, I feel like, they're supposed to be an independent body, they're supposed to be an independent organization, but they're not. They're heavily leaned on by various parts of government at various times, but also they're being led by the news, the media, public opinion. Okay, you could say they're trying to keep pace with it, but they're really sort of being buffeted, and they are inconsistent. They're hugely inconsistent. Some of the time it's just the fact that they just don't like something. I mean, the fact that Furman was able to suppress The Exorcist and was it Straw Dogs on video, for years and years and years, because he just didn't like them. He didn't have a sensible argument for saying these films shouldn't be released into the public domain. He just didn't like them, and I think that's unacceptable.
You've mentioned there a couple of times about like processes and like ways that they like tried to cut these films or like prevent these films from being shown. Do you have any like good example? Like, could you give us an example of how, like, because you're saying there like it was very arbitrary sometimes, how like personal taste and personal beliefs would have prevented certain things. Like, would you have any examples that you'd want to share?
Oh yeah, there's scads of them. There's absolutely hundreds, and again, it's you look at some people, some of the examiners love The Devils, Ken Russell's film. Other examiners absolutely hated it. Some of the examiners write about how it's this brilliant sort of dialogue between good and evil and an exploration of the evil within and man, and someone else is just like, oh, come off it, it's rubbish, and you get the impression that their meetings must have been quite fiery and quite intense, because how do you reconcile those different views? Everybody responds and engages with the film differently. That's why it's so brilliant and so fascinating. But the idea that you have like 8 people, whoever happens to be on a particular rota that day, because they always viewed in pairs, is going to make a decision. And the bit about clipping stuff out and then putting it together and showing just the contentious bits, I mean, that's just really bad policy and practice anyway, because then what are you doing? You're basically saying, yeah, these are the kind of the smutty bits or the nasty bits. Let's all just look at these totally out of context. There's no narrative meaning or purpose to that.
And also, like, one of the things that I would add to that is, the notion that removing 1 second from a film will somehow wholly alter the effect is perverse logic, because presumably you need, if you're trying to process something, you need more information, not less. So the whole notion that James Furman could take a few frames here and there and then somehow completely alter the film or the final effect of the film is just perverse logic in my view. You might as well keep it in rather than take it away.
And a lot of the time, it wasn't just a couple of frames, it was an awful lot of material. And then you have reports objecting to, oh, we don't like the tone, or this feels nasty, or, this character, the way that he behaves is very unpleasant. And you just think,
not the point.
Exactly, it's totally not the point. But they were very critical about all those different elements, not just about what you see as components in the film. So there's that element of personal response, which again bleeds into their decision-making process.
Well, I must say that, we were talking about Furman going along to conferences and showing cut and uncut versions. I mean, that is something that the BBFC still do, or at least were doing 10 years ago. I remember being at De Montfort University as a PhD student. Sean, you were probably at
I was presenting, yeah.
And David Hyman from the BBFC, an examiner there, we watched the uncut scenes from a Serbian film. And I was like, I mean, that's fine, whatever. But I'm thinking to myself, well, how is it okay in this context?
Yeah.
When we've got, academics in the room, and that's the justification. I mean, that's the logic is perverse. It's ridiculous.
It's totally perverse logic, but again, it goes back to that class and almost intellectuals argument, doesn't it? It's just like, it's all right, these people have degrees, they can handle it, they can probably hack it, and that really does kind of underpin a lot of their thinking. It's right for clever people, but the masses, we don't know about that.
Such a gross generalization, isn't it? Because that's mad. Even like you were saying, it could be 8 people on a rota. One of them might have a degree, and the rest of them could be smarter than that one person. You can't judge people by if they've been to university or not based on how intelligent they are.
Absolutely. And studies of audiences and audience behavior, and when you do focus groups, and certainly when you teach, you realize that everybody has different pressure points. Everybody has different things that they bring. You never know what's going to be triggering for somebody. You never know what's going to be an absolute no-no for somebody. It's just part of that process by which we all engage with films differently. We respond differently to different things depending on who we are. Even myself, I said, now that I'm a parent, I have a completely different take on some things. I wish I didn't, but you just think, oh God, now I'm that person.
It is funny how parenthood changes you. I don't want to go off on a tangent about parenthood, but it is like anything involving children now.
Oh God, yeah.
I take a completely different stance on it.
Completely. Totally. Yeah. And it's terrible because the academic side of your brain is saying nothing's changed, it doesn't matter, nothing's changed. And then the other half of you's like, oh, emotional mess.
I'm offended. This is horrible.
I'm going to write to my MP. Yeah. I know, it's just so bizarre.
Is whenever you're recommending something to someone, if they're the same age as you or your close friends, you feel quite comfortable doing it. But let's say it's your little cousin and they've asked you, oh, can I watch this movie? And you kind of go, oh.
Yeah,
I have to make a decision now.
Yeah. My cousin Bonnie, she's just turned 13 and she's starting to get into horror. And my auntie came back, went behind her back and was like, right, here's a list of stuff she wants to watch. Which ones do you think are okay? And I tried to say to her, Bonnie may react differently than I did. She can only really judge for herself. If there's stuff that you as a parent don't want her watching, just sit down and discuss that with her. Maybe explain to her why. Don't just give her a point blank no, because I think Bonnie's intelligent enough to understand that. But she asked me if she could watch the first season of American Horror Story, which has a lot of sexual violence in it. And I said 13's maybe a bit too young. Maybe give her a couple of years so she can put it into context for herself. Because there's certain things in horror you do see, even in my own experience, stuff I watched at 12 at sleepovers means something different to me now at 25.
Yep.
There's a great Martin Barker, Professor Martin Barker, who was sort of at the, was an anti-censorship champion at the height of the video nasties panic, and indeed before and since. There's a great clip of him on a TV show, being asked a question, I want to say by a priest or something. I could be wrong about that. I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure it is. Anyway, they ask him the question, how would you feel about your kids watching I Spit on Your Grave or whatever? And Martin Barker gives a great response. He's like, I'm ambivalent about it. And I guess the point is, it's your decision as an adult to determine if you have like parental responsibility over somebody. It's your, that person better than anybody else. You make the decision. Like, it shouldn't be an upper middle class
stranger making that decision.
A stranger who doesn't know you or your kids. Precisely. If films exist, and they do, if comics, novels, whatever, if your kids have access to these things, you make the decision. And if they are confronted by something that might be upsetting or offensive, they'll be upset for a bit, but it's nothing that they can't come out of. It's about having a discussion with them and saying, well, this is this, and this is why it's upset you. You're not going to become a murderer.
Put it into context. And I think
precisely.
I think especially with, like you were saying, with children, they're a lot better at self-censorship than people give them credit for. Like, if they see something that upsets them, they're not going to actively seek it out again. So I don't.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, no, certainly my 5-year-old watches things and then says, I didn't like that. And then sort of a couple of months later, she says, I'm not watching that again. And you just think, okay, fine, whatever.
Fair enough.
Something else to do. But that he has very sort of strong likes and strong dislikes, so I think you're absolutely right. I think children are very able to determine what they are interested in, what they aren't interested in. And I agree completely with Johhny. If you have a responsibility for a child or a young person, then you have to base your decisions or your advice or your suggestions on them. You can't just sort of look at a category and say, oh, it says, if you're over 12, you'll be fine. Because some 12-year-olds will be and others won't.
Indeed.
Speaking of that, exactly, when I was doing early research for my PhD, Sian, you recommended the BBFC's podcast, and there was a whole big issue around The Woman in Black, because it was the first horror film, like, in donkey's years, it had been made at 12, and they got so many letters from angry parents being like, how dare you let my 12-year-old watch this? And it's like, you're the one that took him to the cinema. Like, surely you should know your child well enough to know that they weren't going to handle that well.
Yeah, it's fascinating though, isn't it? Because again, all you have to do is read around the film, look at the trailer. You know what it's going to be. It's based upon a classic novel. I don't really get it when people say, oh my goodness, I wasn't expecting that. And you think, well, you can't live in a bubble. Again, it's your responsibility. And that, again, is the line that the BBFC takes now. That's the line that they push out. They say they provide guidance. They don't necessarily classify, which isn't true. They do. But they provide guidance to parents and consumers to make decisions.
Guidance is definitely a better word, even if they don't strictly stick to it. Sian, you mentioned earlier, Kim Newman's done quite a lot of work on this, trying to unravel and make sense of where all this panic originated from. And Johhny, again, you kind of touched on it with was it Mary Whitehouse, I believe her name was?
Yeah, and Julian Petley is another scholar that Sian mentioned who's done a lot of work on this as well.
You need to read up on that, because that would be really interesting. Like, after this panel, I'm just going to be buying censorship books. I was fascinated though, because in one of his articles, Kim Newman mentioned that the moral panic here, like you used to be both saying, like that was the key phrase that was going around. He kind of reflected that it was a very specifically British phenomenon. So I was wondering, what are your kind of opinions on that? And did it have any resemblance to the satanic panic that was going on across the water in America?
That's interesting. You go for it, Johhny. I'm cogitating.
Yeah, sure. No, well, I mean, Kim Newman, who I don't know, but obviously who I admire very much. He often, when he writes about this, he often connects it back to the 1970s and the paperback boom, the boom in horror paperbacks, which were termed by the industry nasties. That's what they were called. So James Herbert's The Rats, for instance, Guy and Smith's Night of the Crabs, these grisly short novels about unpleasant things happening to people were termed nasties. But it was an industry term. This wasn't a term that was applied by the media. It was an industry term that they capitalized on. And yeah, okay, so some books were banned from W.H. Smith and whatnot, but there wasn't like a full-scale moral panic. But it is, I think, credible to assume that the term nasty, as it was associated with, books of the early to late 1970s, that probably explains why Peter Chippendale, the journalist who is largely agreed, coined the term video nasties. He probably nicked it from that discourse, as it were. Whether or not it's a British phenomenon, because I'm going to have to plug something here. I've just finished a book on the first decade of the video boom in Britain. So I'm not talking about the video nasties very much, but I'm talking about the industrial context. But in the research that I've done, certainly there were flashes of similar kinds of panics happening elsewhere in places like Belgium, in East Asia, and also in the Nordic countries as well. Not on the same scale, but people losing their minds over obscene horror films infiltrating the home. That's quite a universal discourse, I think.
I think one thing that's also really interesting is the role that the press plays in all of this, in keeping the headlines going, keeping that note of panic in all the all the articles that are written, all the op-eds, all the pieces that grab attention, everything that gets cited, because obviously the press have a completely different agenda here. This is selling copy, this is scandal, so it's exciting and it's going to run and run and run. There's a goodies and baddies, but what's really interesting is the connections that are very casually made between things like copycat violence, between behavior and video and film. And these sort of very casually throwaway connections. Oh, well, my 8-year-old went and did this and then behaved like that. Those became very embedded in this idea that some types of moving image are very damaging, and it sort of feeds into that narrative that, if something horrendous happens, if somebody's very, very disturbed and commits some atrocity or some horrendous crime, what can we pin it on? What were they into? What did they like? So that connection between sort of culture, a cultural form, and behavior became very, very sort of spun by the press.
They lapped that up. This is slightly related, but not really. Even when they were covering Columbine when it first happened, they were oh, these were goth kids. They listened to this kind of music. They dressed in this kind of way, and it's nonsense. There's been so many studies that have proved there is no legitimate correlation between. It's a difference between correlation and causation. You could be the most violent person in the world and watch Teletubbies all day, but that's a different kind of horror, I think. But yeah, it's mad because the press know how to push your buttons. That's what they do. And like you said, John, their goal is to sell copies. They don't care if it's true or not. They just want people to read it.
It's the press, but it's also then people in authority. You have judges speaking out about this. You have, senior police officers speaking out about this. You have religious figures starting to weigh in on this. Certainly in Ireland, north and south, you have people standing up in the pulpit every Sunday saying, this is what you're not going to be seeing. Don't engage with this kind of material, and your parents wouldn't like it. So there is this, again, this link that becomes very established between, we know what's best for you, we are kind of the senior figures, and the press keeps that going.
Do you think now? Oh, sorry, Maria, go ahead.
I was just going to say, the one that always comes to mind for me is I know that when I was a teenager, The Dark Knight came out, and there was that horrible thing that happened in America, the shooting in those screens, and people were like, oh, well, these kind of films coming out, people get ideas, and it's like, well, you can't say that. There's no rhyme or reason that could possibly justify it, and that film certainly didn't.
But it's easier to sort of point at something rather than to try and sort of say, surely this is a social problem, surely this is to do with education or background or poverty or whatever. It's much easier to just say it's that is the problem.
God forbid you would take oh, sorry, go ahead, Johhny.
I was just going to say, it means that the system, as it were, need never be accountable, because it can divert attention to something else. So Margaret Thatcher, for instance, could use the video nasties as the problem that she was going to solve, as it were, without dealing with society's real problems in the 1980s. So this kind of stuff, as Sean says, is an easy win.
it's part of the culture wars, though. I mean, like, you know, David Cameron did this, you know, when he was in Downing Street, you know, he was very big on sort of, oh, we must remove pornographic images from our high street, you know, we've got to kind of clean up things that our children are consuming, you know. And it's exactly the same rhetoric that Mary Whitehouse was using sort of 20, 30 years ago. You know, it's exactly the same. So the debate doesn't really change, but it's very easy to deploy when you want to score political points, because it makes it seem like you are prioritizing things like sort of family and morality and back to the good values, and it's all complete myth, but it allows you to present yourself in that particular way, usually for political gain.
There's always a new target they can grab at.
Oh yeah.
Mm-hmm. I am curious, like, just with, like, because of COVID and everything else, I think a lot of people are losing faith in these kind of authority figures, so they may not listen to the guy in the pulpit every Sunday anymore. They may look at Boris and go, you're an idiot. Like, they wouldn't give him as much, like, authoritative credit as they might have. Do you think that will affect the horror genre as it goes on, or is it just kind of secular, like it'll just come up again another couple of years?
I mean, my sense is that a lot of people who are interested in film don't give two hoots what anyone else is going to say. People are going to watch what they want to watch, and I think now with the different ways in which you can watch and consume, it really is almost irrelevant. It's not saying that cinema is irrelevant, but certainly when I talk to my students, a lot of them say, I don't go to the cinema, you know, I download everything or I stream everything. You know, it's not about going to the pictures and taking part in that sort of ritual almost. It's about, I'm a big film buff, I make my choices and I can watch whatever I like, usually at home.
I guess the change will come if and when we lose control of the internet, you know, if and when the internet becomes super regulated, maybe we'll be having a different conversation. But I mean, to give one example, Netflix, the UK version of Netflix, submit all of their films to the BBFC to be certified. They don't have to do that, right? They don't have to do it, but they choose to do it because they want to appear, you know, like they're towing some line somewhere. However, you can go onto Amazon Prime, who don't, as I understand it, submit everything to the BBFC, and, you know, access uncut versions of William Lustig's Maniac, for instance, from like 1980, which you would never find an uncut version of that on Netflix as it stands, because the BBFC won't pass it uncut, if you see what I'm saying. So it will require, you know, Netflix and the other big giants to collectively toe the BBFC's line for it to really make a difference, I think. But yeah, for the time being, people are just downloading on there.
I guess it's interesting as well, because we don't know what the future is going to bring, but it might just be that different platforms start to acquire different reputations, you know, start to cater to different audiences. You know, Netflix is just like, right, we're in line with BBFC, we're much kind of more middle of the road, you know, less extreme content. Other platforms like, that's not us, we're going to go in a completely different direction. And I think the sort of proliferation of platforms and ways to access material makes that very, very likely.
Even that's fascinating. Like Maria was saying, if you wanted to see The Last Tango in Paris, you couldn't go to Belfast, but you could go to Bangor. Whereas now you just open a different tab and search on a different streaming platform. It's that instant access. It's changed so much.
Absolutely, and it's that instant access is really good in lots of ways, because it gives you access to stuff that, you know, you don't have to go and hunt down anymore. I mean, it's completely different. Even doing sort of academic research these days, it's totally different than it was certainly when I was doing my PhD. You know, we still had the video recorder in the office, and someone's like, "I taped this off the telly last night. Look," you know, and that was usually Sue Harper. But it was a completely different landscape. Whereas now, I think that access is brilliant, but it does raise an awful lot of questions again about who's watching and what they're watching.
Do you think, like, the ease of access that we have kind of diminishes, like, the video nasty's appeal in a way? Because, like, back in the 70s and 80s, they were so hard to get a hold of, and there were, like, die-hard fans who would wait years and years and years to see one specific film, whereas now you can literally just type it into Google and go find it.
I think that the flame of the video nasties is one that will keep burning, right? I mean, it's strange because new generations of horror film fans are coming to this material, and they're wanting to actively seek it out, you know, irrespective of whether or not they're buying a boutique Blu-ray edition, or if they're, torrenting it or whatever. It's an old cliche, but in 2003, when the Texas Chainsaw Massacre was remade, it was the business logic behind that was because the title of that film is so universal, like everybody's heard of that movie. The kids will want to come out and see it. And not to jump too far ahead in the discussion, but we've seen since Censor's release sort of video nasty mania, loads of factually inaccurate articles actually materializing out of, not the one that you were quoted in, Sean, just for the record. That's not.
I don't know. That was pretty ropey at times. I was reading it and I was like, oh god.
But the discourse surrounding the release of that film, everybody's interested in the video nasties again, even though Censor isn't really. It's not a film about video nasties.
No.
Well, you've given us a wonderful segue into it, actually. The question about Censor. So 2021 saw the release of Prano Bailey Bond's horror film Censor. It follows a young woman in the 1980s who works as a censor of video nasties and explores the seemingly dark worlds that this content opens up, and has been called a smart, delirious horror that beyond its sheer gory playfulness hits a rather tender nerve. Have you both seen it? And if so, what did you both think?
You can go first.
Censor. So, I think it's interesting. I was excited at the prospect of seeing it because I'm super interested in the video nasties and all the rest of it. And the marketing very much presents it, I think at least, as some sort of, nostalgia fest in the same way that, people watch Stranger Things or Riverdale or insert Netflix show here. I don't think the film is that. And it's all the better for it, in my opinion. Like, I think that the film itself is effective. It does what it sets out to do. Although I do think that the promotional discourse, the press discourse that surrounds it, is super fascinating, personally. And that is the only answer you're going to get, Sean.
I'm probably going to hedge my bets even further. I was more interested, I suppose, in the fact that it's set in this period that I'm very interested in, and the operational structures of the BBFC is something that's always fascinated me, and that's kind of where the main body of my research lies. So I'm slightly different from Johhny in that respect. And I just found bits of it quite amusing in terms of it plays into a lot of those cliches about, sitting in like gloomy, smoke-filled room, people sort of slamming the table saying, I'm cutting it, I'm going to do this. Because obviously the BBFC didn't do their own cutting. They sent it back and just said, we want this cut. We want you to do X, Y, Z, in these particular reels and in these particular sequences. So I found all that just kind of quite amusing, because it's just kind of, again, perpetuating this myth about what the censor is and what the censor does. As a horror film, but I guess like Johhny, I was just more interested in people writing about it and what they were expecting it to be, and how it's kind of thrown this period kind of back onto the front pages again, saying this is what this film is about, and it isn't really what the film is about at all. So even more obscure. Sorry.
I think the best stuff in the film, actually, I think, is the stuff when you're in the censor's office, like that, to me, because the censor, the board of censors, is never identified as the BBFC. I don't think so. It's the film. Obviously, the film is otherworldly, deliberately in parts, especially as you get towards the end of the film, which I won't ruin. So I don't know. It's having its cake and eating it, I think, with the mythology of the video nasty, because it on the one hand, it appears to present the censors sort of it's a very sort of straight-faced exploration of the censors and what they do. But on the other hand, as Sean suggests, the fact that they're there, like sort of cutting the film or whatever, is it's sort of adding to the mythology. Whereas that, going into the film looking at the film as somebody who, say, might not know much about the practice of the censor itself, that looks to be the serious stuff, whereas the wacky banana stuff comes later in the film. But actually, the film is doing that stuff throughout. It's playing with the idea of what the BBFC is, what the video nasties are, and for that reason, I think it piqued my interest for that reason.
I think it'll be fascinating, just like you were saying, over the next couple of years, seeing how people at this time responded to it. Like there will probably be undergrad dissertations exploring like the media response to this kind of thing. I actually haven't seen it yet. I just haven't had the time. But like you were saying, Johhny, it's even from the trailer, it does seem to mythologize the idea of the censor more than anything, because I wasn't sure if it was going to use it more as a theme or if it was going to be like a very realistic portrayal of it. But from the signs of it, it's not.
The censor stuff, like the actual stuff about censors and videos and whatnot, is like the first quarter of the film from memory. And then it's the film is a character study, and the main character just happens to be a film censor. That's sort of the way that I look at it. It's about, this person gradually, and this is not the somebody who's gradually sort of like, you're going to have to edit this out because I don't know what I'm trying to say. Somebody who's gradually losing touch with reality. And that's what it is. That's the basic sort of premise of the film. I think more, frankly, could have been made of video, to be honest, in the film itself, because that's what the promotional material suggests. But then I quite like that about the film, because I went into it thinking one thing, and in true exploitation film marketing fashion, I was confronted with something else. So, hats off to them.
But just to pick up on your phrase, the sort of having cake and eating it is playing games, because it's sort of saying, well, I know about this stuff, but also isn't this, kind of crazy? Like even the main character being called Enid, the sort of head of the film committee of the GLC in the 70s and the 80s was Enid Wistrit, who wrote about censorship and who actually moved to abolish formally film censorship in the boroughs of London, and a very well-regarded Labour member, and it's just really interesting that they choose that as the main character. So you're kind of watching it and thinking, is this deliberate, or is this just, it has to be deliberate? So it's kind of speaking to an informed viewer, I suppose, and then a more general viewer.
But also, and I'm sorry again to say this, because you probably want to move on and discuss something else. What's also fascinating is how the film portrays the British horror film industry at the time. You've got sort of like dodgy dealing film producers, making video nasties. And I mean, that is bending the truth considerably. But it's because it's that I also like that about the film, to be honest.
I did not expect that.
Well, you can cut all of that out if you like.
Yeah, just cut the whole section.
Cut it.
Cut it
now. Cut
it.
Very on
Yeah. That kind of brings us on to our last question, because initially it was going to be 4 women on the panel. So I'm kind of curious to see what your opinion will be, Johhny. So obviously Censorship was directed by a woman. It features a woman in the protagonist role. Do you think how we perceive video nasties is impacted by gender? Because a lot of the violence you see in video nasties is directed at women, but a lot of the actresses, like, they voluntarily starred in this. There are a lot of academics that study this because they want to, because they're interested. So it is obviously a very general question, but do you think gender has a role in how we perceive video nasties? I know it's a very broad question. It's a very complex issue.
I think so. I think it's important on every level. I think it's important on the level of discourse. I think it's important on the level of content. It's about representation. It's about you know, all those different elements that we think about when we look at films, but also we look at film culture and film response and audiences and all that kind of thing. I think there's always a gendered element to it, but I think because, as you say, a lot of the violence is perpetuated and sort of targeted at women in these films, I think it makes it very, very easy to say that these films fall into the category of they're exploitative, they're damaging, they're harmful, they perpetuate kind of rape revenge. You know, but I think it's too clumsy. It doesn't really do justice to a lot of the material that's there. It's very, very easy to lump it all in and say these are bad films because they're bad to women. And it's just like, well, yeah, are they really? My take on it is that it is important, because of the way in which it's used to kind of pull them apart and argue about them rather than it's intrinsically sort of damaging. That's my take in a very waffly kind of way. Sorry.
I mean, I think that having Prano, Bailey Bond make censor is helpful on a superficial level, because obviously I don't want to imply that the reason that the film has got hype is because Prano happens to identify as a woman. But I think that when you have a woman making a film like Censor, it brings some nuance to the discussion that historically has been quite absent, actually. Like if you go back to the 80s, and you essentially had, reddish-faced white men, and Mary Whitehouse, but mostly reddish-faced white men, and Margaret Thatcher, but mostly reddish-faced white men, saying that these films are bad for women and therefore we should ban them. And I'm a man and I'm making.
I know these things
about that. I mean, there was a program about video nasties on Channel 4 in the 80s called A Gentleman's Agreement. And I mean, that says it all, right?
Wow.
So when you've got somebody like Prano Bailey Bond directing a film like Censor, it says a lot. It says that, well, here's a woman who is a horror fan herself, who is speaking on behalf of a community who historically, at least, has rarely, if you look at video collectors and the video nasty discourse of the 90s, very few women were visible within those fan communities. But now we have, a new enfant terrible in Prano Bailey Bond, waving the flag for women and video nasties. So I think it's a very important image.
I think so. And I think that certainly recent discussions and sort of within academic circles, even in the last kind of 10, 15 years, have sort of really progressed in terms of, there's a lot of women now who write about horror films and sort of talk about them as their primary interests. It's not just a sort of a boys' club anymore. And it's seen as not only acceptable to stand up and say, I really like these films, I'm a huge fan, I'm going to write about them, it's going to be sort of my central thesis of what I do. And I think that's really important as well, because I think for too long, the ideas that these films weren't for women and weren't enjoyed by women and shouldn't be seen by women, I think that was very strong critique of them and very pervasive as well. That's people started to believe that actually, maybe this isn't good for half the population.
It's like, if I could just mention sort of a couple of people who I think are really good examples of turning the discourse on its head. People like Kat Ellinger, who was the editor of Diabolique magazine, Alexandra Helen Nicholas, an Australian film critic. Kat certainly recently just wrote a feminist analysis of Lucio Fulci's The New York Ripper, a film that was refused a certificate in Britain because of its scenes of sexual violence. But now we have somebody offering a feminist critique of that film, essentially saying, to be very reductive, it ain't as bad as you think, or here's another way we can look at this film. And those voices are super important.
Definitely. And I think even like when I was at university doing my own research, a lot of the material that you did see from female academics, especially the older ones, would have been very like typical angry feminist burning bras, being like, this is bad for women for A, B, and C, or women are portrayed badly in A, B, and C. But like, women can enjoy horror just as much as men.
Well, I think
definitely.
in the early 90s,
depends on taste.
Yeah.
Sorry, Sean.
Sorry, no.
I was just going to say, in the early 90s, you had the publication of two books, Men, Women, and Chainsaws by Carol Clover, and The Monstrous Feminine by Barbara Creed, you know, arguably, well, certainly two of the most important books ever written on horror cinema. And, you know, they're not radical feminist diatribes against the genre, and which says a lot about, you know, I'm just going to shut up.
No, I'm glad you recommended them, because like their passion for the genre really shines through, I think.
I guess I'm just hyper aware of that. I'm on a panel with three women, and we're not going to hurt you. I don't want to mansplain the significance of these two women who've written these important books.
No, don't do that. But I think also it's partly to do the sort of rehabilitation of horror essentially as a serious academic object of study. You know, because for years it was seen as kind of the trash end of the market. You know, what do you want to research horror for? It's not really worth anything. It doesn't mean anything. And certainly when Julian Pelly in the 80s sort of wrote about this lost continent of British cinema and fetishizing things like the British New Wave and the sort of the films of the swinging 60s and things like that, we're completely ignoring popular cinema. You know, it might be crime, might be gangster, might be horror, might be, you know, even people like Pam Kirk and Sue Harper sort of researching the women's film and melodramas, saying that's important too. You know, it's all just part of a bigger picture. And I think horror has really suffered about not being taken seriously or not being seen as critically important or academic.
Definitely. I would like to think that like the scope of the academic world is changing on that, because even when I was growing up, if I had said, oh, I'm having a sleepover and this day we're going to watch this, you would have people looking at you being like, why would you want to do that? And it gets worse when you try to quote unquote take it seriously as an academic. People kind of look at you like unless they themselves are into horror, it's hard to explain to someone who doesn't like horror why it's important, why it's interesting, even if the actual content you're studying is horrific. Like Sian, a main part of your research is audience reaction and reception studies. Even seeing how people react is fascinating and has value, because it tells you a little bit about that era, what people in general found, because obviously personal taste varies, but what people in general in that time found okay and what they didn't find okay.
Absolutely, and that's sort of my main interest, I suppose, just in seeing how sort of taste changes over time. And I think there's a lot of myths about, oh, as a society we're much more liberal and much more accepting now, whereas actually that's not true. It kind of swings back and forth depending on so many different factors. But I think to try and dispel some of those myths about, oh, you know, women don't like horror, or older people don't like this, or, you know, this is, you know, it just, I get really frustrated about the sort of randomness that's applied. See, I'm going off on one now about, you know, what we think we know about audiences, and actually we know nothing about audiences. We can never be those audiences. We can never recreate those historical audiences. And I think, just coming back to a previous point about, this is where the press has a role to play, because it kind of becomes like the historical shorthand. This is the truth as it is established, and then this will just kind of get passed on and passed on and passed on and picked up by sort of subsequent press articles, and it just becomes the established sort of fact, if you like, which I think horror definitely as a genre, but certainly the video nasties as specific objects, have really suffered from. I think there might have been a point in there, but I can't remember what it was. It's very late.
I know, it's like, yeah.
No, I actually was like, when I was listening to you there, I was like, that's honestly so true, because like as a kid you're kind of told like, oh, you see those, no, those books over there, they're not nice books, they're not very nice books, you know. And like as a kid I loved Goosebumps. I was obsessed with the Goosebumps books. And then you get kind of scared out of them by, you know, older parents or like librarians were kind of like, maybe don't go near those. But like what you're doing is actually saying to somebody like, you're not allowed to enjoy that. And that's something that kind of sticks with people, because for a very long time I would have said, oh, I don't like horror films at all. And it's not true. I actually like some horror films, like a lot, you know, but it's about finding the right one, the right genre within it for you.
Or even what you said, like you're not allowed to like it, but you kind of get like, am I a bad person? Am I a weird person for liking this? And you kind of internalize that, like especially I think with women
as well. Especially there's this idea that like it's a very unfeminine thing, despite the fact that females are so much a part of it.
Horror would not exist without the female characters, whether they are a victim or a perpetrator or just like a regular run-of-the-mill character. They are so integral to the genre, and it baffles me that people are like, women can't like this, it's not for you.
Well, I mean, I think that the tide is changing insofar as that. I mean, you've just got to look at the scholarly interest groups of the Society for Cinema and Media Studies and the British Association of Film, Television and Screen Studies. BAFTS, the latter organisation, is just in the last year established a horror studies group, and all the conveners are women. I'm one of the co-chairs of the other group, with two women, and like anecdotally, there are lots of women researching this stuff, and indeed like horror studies as regarded as like a discipline, or at least a sub-discipline now. You wouldn't have had that 20 years ago. So
you wouldn't, and so many different approaches, and I think people like Alison Pierce and obviously like Kate Egan, people like that have really sort of been not necessarily trailblazers, because I don't think either one of them would like being described in that way, but I think they've really contributed something massively valuable to say, this is what I'm passionate about, this is what I'm interested in. And I examined a PhD last year by Martin Smith, who was at Northumbria with Johhny as a PhD student. And, his PhD was about sort of people's memories of watching The Exorcist. And it was fascinating because, again, it was really interesting. He could pull out all this stuff about gender, and a lot of it was kind of coming of age, like, oh, I remember that was such a fundamentally important part of my sort of film experience, my film education, and there's some really, really interesting stories from women talking about how this was such a gateway to horror. And it was just a really fascinating piece of work. And to me, it just really sort of spoke to this idea that we don't know anything about people's motivations, so it's really dangerous to sort of fall into this trap of saying, oh, people don't like this, or that's not for you.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that kind of wraps it up. I'm not sure unless Maria's got any burning questions.
Well, I do have one more for you. It's to finish up, we'd love to know, what's your favourite video nasty?
Yeah.
You could tell us that one too, and if there's one that you've been desperately wanting to see.
Oh my God. I will pass over to my esteemed colleague.
You know what it is? These questions, right? Like, are the kind of questions that I need like 10 to 15 minutes
minimum. Yep.
To think. I've got loads of favorites. I actually think I Spit on Your Grave is an important film for numerous reasons, and it's a film that is problematic for sure, but also I think the discourse that movie is now part of wholly contradicts what everybody was worried about in the 1980s when it was released onto video. And this is another thing that we should say about the video nasties. A lot of these films would not have any reputation if it wasn't for the video nasty scandal. Like, a lot of these films are still sold all over the world, primarily because they were associated with the video nasties panic in Britain. So it birthed their reputation. Do I want to end on I Spit in Your Grave? I'm not sure that I do, to be honest. Lucio Fulci's Zombie Flesh It Is. That's my favorite. Thank you.
I'm going to be much more conventional. It's probably something like Texas Chainsaw or Last House on the Left or something like that, because again, it was such a fundamental. I mean, I grew up on kind of like the Point horror series, and they scared the bejesus out of me when I was a teenager. And it's a world that I didn't really understand about, darkness and teenagers driving cars, because they're also heavily Americanized, and babysitters and all this kind of stuff, so it was just, and they were real kind of like, oh my God, this is the grown-up version of that slightly teenage world. So yeah, there you go. I'm glad we got Point horror in there. That's great.
Me too. I'm really happy about that, actually, because I've got a shelf of them over there. I'm working back through them.
Oh, are they still scary? Scary?
They're cheesy as well. Yeah.
Yeah. They're so good though. There's a podcast I listen to, going back to what Maria was saying about Goosebumps. It's 3 grown men in their 30s who go back and read every single Goosebumps book and then talk about it. And there's so many things that I didn't pick up on as a kid that are just so cheesy and so American. Like, I didn't know what a parka was for years, but every character in this bloody book series had a parka. I think it's a coat. I'm not sure.
High point of cool.
Oh, it's just the covers. The covers are what stick with you. Like there's what the Goosebumps one that I always remember is Say Cheese and Die.
Okay.
You know,
Is
like
that the one where it's like the skeletons at the barbecue?
yeah, like it's incredible.
So good. Oh God. Well, thank you both so much for joining us. I feel like I learned a lot, and I hope Maria did as well.
Absolutely.
Good. I feel like I learned a lot, so that was nice.
Me too.
Good, I'm glad. For you guys out there watching, if you want to learn a wee bit more about it, go in a bit more in depth, Sian's book is Censoring the 1970s, the BBFC and the Decade That Taste Forgot. And if you want to go and have a look at some of Johhny's stuff, he has recently published a book called Contemporary British Horror Cinema. And is it the fellowship that you were talking about earlier, the British horror film in the 80s and 90s?
Yeah, that's right. I'm doing that at the moment.
Brilliant.
Which is, I could talk about, I'm not going to say anything about it yet, because we'll be here for days. But
No
I am doing
worries.
that. I'm having lots of fun doing it. Thank you.
It does sound very exciting.
Thanks.
Well, thank you both so much, and thank you all for watching.
Thanks very much for having us.
You're very welcome. Bye.